The transition to wage labor in large multi-unit corporations brought about by the Industrial Revolution also saw a great deal of change in working conditions. Where there had once been many different producers organized around families, now there were just a few firms. Greater concentration of production into the hands of fewer firms gave those firms market power. That market power extended to the market for labor, where firms could be demanding of employees. Working conditions were, in many cases, quite brutal. Hours were long, and the work was backbreaking and repetitive. Employers also engaged in many abuses. There are stories of workers being barred from wearing wristwatches so that bosses could fiddle with the company clock and steal workers' time. Some employers imposed moral sanctions on their employees, hiring officers to patrol the local bars and gathering places and punishing workers who stayed out late or were found wandering home drunk. In Europe, workers were in some respects used to this kind of authoritarian rule, but in the United States, where ordinary men had the power of the vote, workers started to join together to oppose the influence of their employers. Labor unions are an organization of workers who have come together to achieve common goals, such as protecting the integrity of their trade, improving safety standards, and obtaining better wages, benefits, and working conditions. Through solidarity, workers would act as one and insist that management meet their demands. Union membership rose through the 19th century and really took off in the beginning of the 20th century. Through collective bargaining, workers secured shorter work weeks. The typical work week in 1880 was around 60 to 70 hours, which was eventually shortened to our modern 40 hours. They also improved safety conditions and negotiated higher wages, though much of that success is also due to labor laws being passed at the urging of these unions. It is important to understand that both excess power on the part of firms and excess power on the part of workers lead to poor economic outcomes. Labor demand is made up of firms who hire workers. When firms grow in size and face less competition with other firms for workers, they gain what the economist Joan Robinson called monopsony power. You've almost certainly heard of a monopoly, which is the sole seller of a product. A monopsony is the sole buyer of something, in this case of labor. With monopsony power, firms are able to suppress wages. It means that fewer workers will want to work for the company, but essentially the firm is able to increase profits by lowering labor costs more than they lower revenue. We can see this by thinking about the surplus. They're capturing some of the workers' surplus, but at the expense of some market inefficiency and deadweight loss in the form of lower employment. This is bad news for both workers and the economy, and just as they do with wages, firms can also suppress worker compensation via worse working conditions. Labor unions flip the script. If enough workers join the union and agree to act in solidarity, they become a monopoly on the supply of labor. The union is then able to extract higher wages up to the maximum the firm is willing to pay, which would be based on the marginal product of labor. Unions take back that surplus and then some, transferring it to the workers. But notice that this too is inefficient with lower employment. In theory, it is possible that the union and the firm will be able to negotiate themselves to the wage that would otherwise be set by the market, and with it, the full employment we would hope to see. But in practice, this is difficult, especially when market conditions change. In the end, both large firms and labor unions tend to keep things stuck in place. The bargaining chip unions have is the ability to go on strike, which is when all the workers in the union stop working in protest. Perhaps the largest strike to ever happen was the Pullman Strike in 1894. It started in Pullman, near Chicago, a company town where the biggest employer was Pullman Company, owned by George Pullman. You can start to see the problem. The Pullman Company produced railroad cars, and by this time had a virtual monopoly on the production of sleeper cars, which allowed passengers to sleep when traveling across long distances. The company was so big, they actually built the town of Pullman. But as you might imagine, workers who moved their lives and family there didn't have many options. Pullman had a monopsony on their labor. Many of Pullman's workers joined the American Railway Union, which was led by Eugene Debs. In 1893, there was a financial panic which led to many bankruptcies in the railroad industry. Business slowed down considerably, and George Pullman decided to cut the wages of his workers. Debs organized a strike, and the movement grew from there, eventually evolving over 250,000 workers across 27 states and shutting down a huge amount of railroad travel. Eventually, President Grover Cleveland stepped in and forced the workers to end the strike. Debs ended up in jail over the incident, but later joined the Socialist Party of America and was their nominee for president 5 times. Unions have waned since their heyday in the first half of the 20th century, largely because business has become more competitive. There are fewer company towns and more choice as to where one works. So long as workers have choice in their employment and firms compete to attract them to the job, labor markets can take care of themselves. But in this gilded age of greater concentration of business into the hands of powerful bosses, unions prove to be an important part of the fabric of American life and won the American worker many important victories.